Today's discussion is concerned with the movement for social reform in the course of the 19th century, which was a kind of a creative engagement with the West. We all know that Western education made a very deep impact on the intellectuals in India in the 19th century who began to respond to some of the rationalist ideas. And on the basis of those rationalist ideas, the Indian intellectuals started reassessing their tradition, religious tradition included. Reassessment of social practices also began to feature fairly prominently in many of these reform movements. It is not, however, expected that all the Indian intellectuals would actually follow the same line of reasoning, because the intellectual world itself was divided into reformist and orthodox sections. There were people who were grooved in traditional education, and one may actually label them as a kind of traditional intelligentsia who wanted to resist such alien influences by extolling the greatness of the ancient cultural heritage, and was also prepared to condone some of the practices which the reformers would look upon as barbaric and uncivilized. So it's a very complex history to which we actually are turning now, making an assessment of the way 19th century reformism had evolved through various kinds of opposition that also emerged from within the Indian society. But education was not the only incentive for the people to reflect on our own society or reflect on tradition. Christian proselytization also lurked in the backdrop, posing a kind of challenge both to the orthodox and the reformists. It is also important to note certain common points that emerge from the engagement of both the reformist and the orthodox sections of the intelligentsia with Christianity. It might create an impression that they were speaking the same language, but they were not. So, this is the larger context in which we are going to place one of the defining movements of the 19th century, one of the early movements which had a lasting impact on the way the modern Indian man actually began to look upon himself as the bearer of this new rationalist thought. You are familiar with the outlines of the Brahmo movement, and the Brahmo movement ultimately didn't succeed. It became divided into many sectarian formations, and by the early part of the 20th century, the distinctive identity that the Brahmos had been able to achieve in the 19th century was also lost. Devendranath, in fact, admitted the failure of the Brahmos in one of his essays, in which he suggested that the Brahmos had in the 19th century served a very important purpose of providing a shock to a kind of static Indian society. And by the early part of the 20th century, once this purpose has been served, it was pointless to think of the difference between the mainstream Hindu society and the Brahmos. So this was one way of assessing the impact of the Brahmo movement in the sense of an ultimate failure to emerge as a sectarian religious order. But Rabindranath also recognized the kind of impact that Brahmoism made on our thought, on our culture. But there was another kind of assessment which comes from people like Shivnath Shastri or Bipin Chandra Pal, who were Brahmos, but who also at one point of time realized that the main impact of Brahmoism was in political culture, arguing that it was from the Brahmos emerged the idea of a free-thinking individual who would be able to absorb democratic ideas, who would be able to translate the Western ideal of free-thinking individual into Indian social or political practice.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes?
How do you read this ideal in Rammohan's thought?
Yeah, I think there is some ground for making an assessment of Rammohan's thought in terms of individualism. because at one level Rammohan was very keen to uphold the pristine Aryan religion, Vedic religion, but at another level Rammohan was actually placing great stress on individuality. Atman. What was Atman all about? It is the self, and the freedom that he gave to self, ultimately to realize Godhood, is a kind of free thinking individual as an ideal. You see this in Protestant thinking in Europe as well, that there were people who believed that man had the ability to unite with God, and this kind of individualism, which would allow a kind of personal God to be worshipped by the free-thinking individual, is implicit in the notion of the Atman. So this Atman-Brahman equation that Rammohan makes suggests at one level a man's ability to unite with God, at another level it's his capability as well, capable of elevating himself to a higher level, unite with God. So that is where I think the idea of a free-thinking individual, which the late 19th century Brahmos were actually propagating, acquires some relevance. But it is not needlessly that Rabindranath himself described Rammohan as the father of modern India. He brought about certain modern trends. He taught his disciples and followers new ideas derived from Western thought, but there was a constant attempt on Rammohan's part to blend these Western thoughts with Indian tradition. And at the core of it, there was a conscious repudiation of idolatry. And it is not simply that he derived these lessons from Western thought or from his exposure to Unitarian Christianity, about which he always had his soft feelings throughout his life, but also from within the Indian rationalist tradition, Islamic rationalist tradition. And the clear evidence of this absorption of rationalist ideas from within the indigenous tradition was a tract that he had apparently composed in his youth called Tuhfat-il-Muhiddin, in which he was actually criticizing idolatrous practices and calling attention to the tradition of monotheism in Indian culture, going back to the Vedic monotheism. It is not strictly true, because Vedic religion also permitted worship of other gods as well. It was a polytheistic culture. But Rammohan interpreted this in the light of some Upanishads, the root of monotheism in Indian culture. And this was, as you know, to a large measure provoked by his encounter with Christianity. When Christian missionaries were actually disparaging Indian society, Indian religious practice, with very pejorative labels of a polytheistic culture, Rammohan combated these Christian missionaries by going back to this different tradition in Indian religious thought, the monotheistic tradition. So one may argue that the emphasis that he puts on the Vedas and on monotheism was a consequence of his encounter with Christianity. And the ideal of free-thinking individual, which had in its center a deep faith in rationalism, would eventually be employed to make an assessment of the social practices. Obviously, the movement against sati, the widow burning, was the most important case in point, for which Rammohan achieved great fame, but at the same time also provoked great hostility. So he was actually asking his followers to go to these ancient texts of Hindu religion, the Vedas, and to find out if many of these practices, including sati, had any legitimacy, had any scriptural foundation. So there is a deep intellectual element in it, where the assessment of a religious tradition became contingent on scriptural authority. So it was with these objectives that he not merely campaigned in favor of sati, pleaded with the government for more direct intervention in social practices, earned the hostility of the conservative people, and eventually went to England to press home the cause of reform before the Privy Council. By way of defining what was pristine Hinduism, he wished to start a movement also. for which reason he set up the Brahmo Samaj. The Brahmo Samaj was set up, as you know, in 1828 in order to start a movement against the debased practices in Hindu religion and to make people aware of Vedic Hinduism. However much it was disliked by the conservatives, who by then had organized in Hindu Dharma Sabha, Rammohan had been able to make some impression on the forward-looking intellectuals of the time. But once he was in England, the Brahmo Sabha that he had set up began to languish. And it could be revived after his death by Devendranath Tagore.
Sir, what were the cardinal feature of Devendranath's religious ideas?
To a large extent, Devendranath also continued the same search for pristine Hinduism. But there was a difference, actually. If you look a little more closely at his religious ideas, unlike Rammohan, who was more firmly embedded in Vedic religious thought, Devendranath had imbibed some influence from Sufism. Unlike Rammohan, who would put great stress on rationalism, using reason for purposes of making an assessment of religious practice, Devendranath was willing to give some space to devotion. There was a mysticism in it. And Devendranath, inspired to some extent by this exposure to devotional ideas, would not actually make a straight equation between Atman and Brahman. He had a dualistic sense that the God is something separate, and it is important for people to strive for that superior level. Atman-Brahman relationship doesn't feature in Devendranath so strongly as it was in Rammohan. But ultimately, one has to go along with the view that both Rammohan and Devendranath, who managed to revive Brahmo Samaj, was keen to bring before public this other tradition. Devendranath also was aware of the fact that Vedic religion had polytheistic content, but one important dimension, once again, in Devendranath is this constant engagement with Christianity. We know that Devendranath had a running debate with people like Alexander Duff regarding proselytization. He was willing to engage with Christianity and combat it by going back to this source of pristine Hinduism. And it was with this objective he revived Brahmo Samaj in 1842, made an impression on the educated classes, and it was during Devendranath's time that the Brahmo movement began to spread out from Calcutta. Particularly, it became strong in eastern Bengal with the establishment of Dhaka Brahmo Samaj. The Brahmas, by the 1850s, had begun to acquire a distinct sectarian identity as well. The Adi Brahmo Samaj, which was presided over by Devendranath and which was willing to maintain the connection with the mainstream Hindu society, ultimately became one of the many Samajas that came one after another. Devendranath's Adi Brahmo Samaj was so named once one of his followers, Keshav Chandra Sen, actually seceded from it and established Bharatvarsha Brahmo Samaj in the 1860s, perhaps in 1866. And from then on, the Brahmo Samaj was divided into two different groups. One was the Adi Brahmo Samaj, which was following Devendranath, and the other one is Bharatvarsha Brahmo Samaj. And the main difference arose from on questions of caste, on participation of women. Bharatvarsha Brahmo Samaj wanted to adopt a more radical position. Under Keshav Sen's leadership, they formed distinct communities, propagated Brahmanism with a kind of missionary zeal. There were small groups who lived together in order to preach the greatness of the Brahmo thought and religion. And as I said, that the main issues which divided Adi Brahmo Samaj and the Bharatvarsha Brahmo Samaj arose from certain social practices, not necessarily religious views. On these questions, serious differences occurred, and Brahmo movement became divided. And this kind of division continued also in later times, when more radically inclined Brahmos would actually refuse to accept Keshav Sen's leadership and would then form Sadharan Brahmo Samaj, which of course is a later happening and which has concerned with the manner in which Keshav Chandra Sen, in an attempt to blend features of Vaishnava religion with Brahmo religious practice, tried to introduce a new dispensation or Navavidhan. But by 1870s, as I was saying, a distinct Brahmo identity began to be formed. And this has something to do with the Brahmo Marriage Act in 1872. And with Keshav Sen was associated some people like Shivnath Shastri or Vijay Krishna Goswami, who later on found Keshav Sen's leadership, as I was saying, inadequate. And this inadequacy was perceived in Keshav Sen's anxiety to build bridges with mainstream Hindu society. He became a devotee of Ramakrishna. By then, Ramakrishna had become a very well-known mystic in Calcutta, and Keshav Sen was one of his devotees. Keshav Sen allowed his daughter to be married to the Prince of Kuch Bihar, even though she was a minor. So this Kuch Bihar marriage and Keshav Sen's devotionalism and his anxiety to impose a kind of Gurubad on the Brahmas ultimately provoked a rebellion in Bharatvarsha Brahmo Samaj and led to the establishment of Sadharan Brahmo Samaj. And it was from within the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj emerged the political doctrine more sharply than in earlier times. The political doctrine of free-thinking individual capable of contributing to democratization of society. Bipin Pal, as I was saying, was making his assessment of the Brahmo movement precisely in these ways in his autobiography, in which he said that the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj, men like Shivnath Shastri, Bipin Chandra Pal or Vijay Krishna Goswami, who had become somewhat unhappy about Keshav Sen's attitudes towards devotionalism, Keshav Sen's new approach to religion by way of participating in Kirtan, the Navavidhan that he preached, and since there were serious differences with these radical Brahmos on these issues, the further splitting of the Brahmo movement was somewhat inevitable. Once Sadharan Brahmo Samaj was founded in 1878, the leadership of the Brahmo movement actually passed into the hands of the Sadharan Brahmas. And these Sadharan Brahmas became very important in the political mobilization of early nationalism. Some historians would be inclined to argue that in early nationalist politics in Bengal, there was a distinct Brahmo group who acknowledged the leadership of men like Surendranath Banerjee, whose support base came from these Brahmas of the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj.
Sir, how would you place Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar in this whole story of reform?
That is a very important question which needs to be answered. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar was committed to reforms, about which the Brahmins were also eloquent. Say Shivnath Shastri was as much emphatic about the need to introduce widow remarriage as Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar was. You are all aware of the fact that in 1856 the Widow Remarriage Act was enacted, but after 1857, when the British tried to tread on a more conservative path, they were not very keen anymore to enforce this law. They wanted to soft pedal, and it was in this context that Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar tried to mobilize opinion in favor of widow remarriage, and for the same reason he had earned the hostility of the conservative social leaders. Just in the same way, Rammohan became a major target of their wrath, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar also, for some such reasons, invited the hostility of the conservative sections of Calcutta society. You know that Ishwar Chandra had a very ambitious educational project which included women's education and mass education. But widow remarriage, or the campaign for widow remarriage, was certainly the main item on his agenda. But there was one important difference between the Brahmas who articulated similar ideas and Vidyasagar. The Brahmas, like Shivnath Shastri or their political counterparts in the Indian Association or even in the Congress, would actually like the state to intervene directly in social practices and religious practices in order to change the society. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, on the other hand, would not actually go along with the Brahmas in creating a distinct social and religious identity of their own. On the contrary, he would be willing to function from within the mainstream society, trying to educate the mainstream society about the need for reforms and educate them to such an extent that there would not be any need for some kind of external intervention by the colonial state. But the kind of hostility that Vidyasagar had to encounter ultimately forced him to go to Karmatar at Santal Pargana to live like a recluse. Similar fate actually awaited many other reformers who tried with these reforms. Chiplonkar also in Bombay also had similar experience. Widow remarriage didn't become a wide practice. There was resistance, and Chiplonkar had to face opposition in the same way Vidyasagar had faced. Virasalingam Pantalu, a man from Andhra who also tried to organize similar movements and ultimately faced hostility from the conservatives and a kind of loneliness that was the fate of such reformers. The failure on their part should not actually undermine their importance. The Brahmo movement failed, many of the reformist initiatives didn't succeed, but they were able to generate a new political culture conducive for initiatives in future towards the same objectives. The impact of the Brahmo movement can also be assessed in terms of the manner in which similar reformist initiatives were undertaken by their friends elsewhere in India, people who were impressed by the Brahmo ideology, who had personal connections with the Brahmo leadership. We can talk about Maharashtra, for example, during the 1860s. Keshav Sen, as you know, was a great organizer. He went to Bombay in 1864 and then once again in 1867 made a deep impression on the educated classes in the city. And it is in this context that one has to explain the establishment of Brahmo Samaj in Bombay, to cite one major example of similar initiatives elsewhere in this country, formed by the new intelligentsia, the educated Parsis, and mainly the Saraswat and the Chitpavan Brahmins, who were the early graduates of Elphinstone College. But let us actually think in terms of the way people who were friendly towards Keshav Sen were responsible for initiating a similar kind of reform movement in Bombay. It started with Paramahamsa Mandali, of course, set up by Atmaram Pandurang. It was a kind of a secret meeting in which deliberations took place about casteism, about idolatry. A link was established with the Brahmo Samaj. But Prarthana Samaj managed to retain a distinctive identity. They were not so radically inclined as the Sadharan Brahmas were. They were not very keen to alienate the mainstream society in the way the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj did, or the Brahmo movement generally made in Bengal. But there was one thing in common, because most of the leaders of early nationalism came from the Prarthana Samaj outfit. It was from within this reform movement the early nationalists had their early training. And this is epitomized by the personality of Mahadev Govind Ranade. Eventually, in the 1880s, the Prarthana Samaj initiative was to a large extent undermined by the Arya Samaj's challenge in the region. In the 1890s, the challenge against this kind of reformism became more pronounced with the organization of orthodox religious order by the Sanatanists, which is a different story.
Sir, what was the impact of Brahmo movement in southern part of India?
If we come to southern India, we see the same kind of connection at work. Keshav Sen went to Madras and he converted many South Indian intellectuals who had earlier formed the Ved Samaj into Brahmanism. Or rather, to put it differently, people who were actually by then deliberating on monotheism, etc., were under the impact of Keshav Sen formed the Ved Samaj. The man who played a very critical role in the establishment of Ved Samaj, modelled on the Brahmo Samaj, was Sri Dharalu Naidu, who was in Calcutta, who was a disciple of Keshav Sen, who tried to use the Brahmo model for organizing this. Then you have the example of Virasalingam Pantalu. I was talking about Virasalingam a little while ago. We know from Bipin Pal's memoirs, Shivnath Shastri's memoirs, that at Rajamundri, both of them went to Rajamundri in Andhra. Virasalingam Pantalu had set up an organization partly inspired by the Brahmo example, which began to campaign for widow remarriage. Once again, just like Vidyasagar was unable to break through the resistance of the traditional society, Pantalu also didn't succeed. But as I was saying already, that such failures should not be taken as evidence of an ultimate failure, because ultimately these contributed to the making of modern India, even though towards the close of the 19th century, these reformist initiatives were very powerfully challenged by different kinds of religious movements. Some of these religious movements were forward-looking. Take, for example, the Vivekananda movement with the same emphasis on Vedanta. Once again, personal God, reformism, all this entire baggage came with Vivekananda. But some of these, Arya Dharam, for example, which was propagated by Dayananda Saraswati, had similar impact, reformist impact. But alongside such examples of reformism, you have the more conservative orthodox position, where resistance to all kinds of reforms came from the Sanatanists. And together, these forces eventually combined in the 1890s to create the basis of militant nationalism, which is of course a different story, but one has to make an assessment of the kind of challenge that this reformism was encountering from 1880s and 1890s by way of a different kind of religious movement, inspired to some extent by reformism, but motivated at the same time by a keenness to resist reform at all cost.